In March of 2026, the Strait of Hormuz shut down. Oil prices blew past $100 a barrel within hours. Countries from the Philippines to Canada went into full panic mode. Emergency meetings, fuel rationing threats, prices spiking overnight. And China kept the lights on, factories humming. No emergency speech, no gas lines, nothing. That is exactly what this video is about. How China solved the Strait of Hormuz problem that has haunted every major economy on Earth for decades, and how they did it so quietly that almost nobody noticed until the moment it actually mattered. If you want to understand one of the biggest geopolitical chess moves of the last 20 years, you are in the right place. Hit like and subscribe so you do not miss what we cover next. And let's get into it. To truly understand how China pulled this off, we need to go back in time. Because this story did not start in 2026, it started over 30 years ago, in a quiet government office on the other side of the world. The wake-up call that started everything. The year is 1991. A group of government officials in Beijing are watching the news. On screen, the United States military is running Operation Desert Storm in the Persian Gulf. Warships, airstrikes, and complete control over the sea lanes. For most people watching, it looked like a war. For those officials in Beijing, it looked like a warning. Here is what they understood that most people missed. The Persian Gulf is where a huge chunk of the world's oil comes from. And to get that oil out, tankers have to squeeze through a narrow stretch of water called the Strait of Hormuz. It is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That is roughly the length of a marathon. And at the time, the United States Navy had near total control over what passed through it. If you depend on oil from that region and someone else controls the gate, you do not really control your own economy. Simple as that. That same year, China quietly crossed a massive line. For decades, China had produced more oil than it used. But in 1991, that flipped. China became a net oil importer, meaning it now needed more oil than it could produce at home. And the way things were trending, that gap was only going to grow bigger every single year. So, here was the situation. Over 1 billion people, an economy growing at full speed, hundreds of millions of new workers entering factories and buying cars and using electricity for the first time. And most of the fuel powering all of it had to travel through a narrow waterway controlled by a foreign navy. That is not a comfortable position to be in. That is a vulnerability sitting right at the heart of everything. Then came 2003. The United States invaded Iraq. China watched a major oil-producing country get reshaped by outside military force in a matter of weeks. What had been an abstract concern suddenly felt very real. If it could happen to Iraq, it could happen to any country China depended on for energy. The supply chain China was building its entire future around was sitting on a foundation that someone else controlled. China's leader at the time gave this problem a name. He called it the Malacca dilemma. Around 80% of China's imported oil had to pass through either the Strait of Hormuz or the Strait of Malacca. Both were tight choke points. Both were watched by foreign navies. One disruption, one conflict, one decision made thousands of miles away by people with completely different interests, and China's economy could be starved of fuel almost overnight. Think about that for a second. You are running the world's most populous country. Your economy is growing faster than any economy in history. Hundreds of millions of people are counting on that growth to lift them out of poverty. And the single most important input to all of it, the energy that keeps everything moving, has to pass through two narrow water passages that you do not control and cannot protect. That was the moment a decision was made. Not a policy paper, not a 5-year plan, a vow. China would never again let a single stretch of water hold its entire economy hostage. And what they built over the next 2 decades to keep that vow is one of the most patient, carefully constructed strategies in modern history. Here is where it gets interesting because the first move did not happen in the Middle East at all. It happened somewhere much colder, much more remote, and completely out of reach of any foreign navy. The 2 escape routes nobody was watching. The first escape route ran north deep into Siberia. Russia had enormous oil and gas deposits sitting under some of the most remote land on Earth. Vast frozen wilderness, thick forests, ground that stays frozen for most of the year. And underneath all of it, some of the largest untapped energy reserves anywhere on the planet. China needed energy. And here was the key insight that changed everything. You could connect the two entirely over land with a pipeline. No ocean crossing, no strait to pass through, no foreign warship anywhere near it. That pipeline is called the ESPO, the Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean Pipeline. It stretches thousands of miles from the Russian interior and plugs directly into northeastern China. Oil flows from Russian ground to Chinese refineries without touching a single drop of seawater. Not one drop. The entire journey happens on land through terrain, so remote that disrupting it would require an operation of extraordinary scale and cost. The first agreements were signed in the mid-2000s quietly, while most of the world's attention was focused on the Middle East. The first oil started flowing in 2011. Then came expansions in 2018, 2020, and 2022, each one adding more capacity, each one strengthening the connection between Russian supply and Chinese demand. While headlines were being written about other things entirely, a natural gas pipeline called the Power of Siberia followed in 2019, pumping Russian gas directly into Chinese homes and factories, heating buildings, powering industrial plants, fueling the kind of economic activity that keeps a country running through winter. Again, entirely overland. Again, completely outside the reach of any naval blockade. Then in 2022, something happened that China could not have scripted better if it tried. Western countries placed heavy sanctions on Russia because of the war in Ukraine. European nations rushed to cut off Russian energy, scrambling to find alternate suppliers at enormous cost and difficulty. And Russia suddenly had almost no major buyers left for its most valuable export. China already had the infrastructure in place. The pipes were built, the agreements were done, the technical systems were running, and with Russia now desperate for reliable revenue, China negotiated from a position of complete strength. More oil delivered at better prices, with payments made in Chinese yuan instead of US dollars, shifting even the financial architecture of the deal away from Western influence. By 2024, Russia had become China's single largest crude oil supplier, delivering millions of barrels every day through pipelines that no blockade on Earth could stop and no foreign government could intercept. But China was not relying on just one escape route, because smart strategists do not build a single backup plan. They build several. And while the northern pipeline was being expanded, a second route was quietly taking shape on the other side of the map, running through some of the most dramatic mountain terrain on the planet. Find Pakistan on a map. Now trace your finger to its southwestern corner to a small port town on the Arabian Sea called Gwadrar. 20 years ago, almost nobody outside the immediate region had heard of it. It was a modest fishing town on a stretch of coastline that the rest of the world had largely ignored. Today, it is one of the most strategically important pieces of real estate on the planet. And China essentially built its modern infrastructure from scratch. The logic behind Gwadar was elegant. The Strait of Hormuz sits right there at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Gwadar sits just outside it on the open Arabian Sea, already past the Chokepoint. The plan was straightforward in concept, but enormous in execution. Land oil tankers at Gwad before they ever reach the strait. Move that oil overland through Pakistan by road, rail, and pipeline. Deliver it directly into western China, through the mountain passes of the Karakoram Range. No Strait of Hormuz, no Strait of Malacca, no long, vulnerable ocean journey through waters where anything could happen. In 2013, China launched the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, known as CPEC. The investment topped $62 billion, flowing into highways cutting through mountain passes. Railway lines connecting cities that had never been linked before. Power plants bringing electricity to regions that had gone without it for decades. Fiber optic cables, industrial zones, and at the southern tip of it all, a deep-water port at Gwad, leased to a Chinese state-owned company for 40 years. 40 years. Let that sink in. That is not a short-term deal or a speculative bet. That is a commitment that stretches across generations of leadership, political cycles, and technological change. Beijing did not just invest in a port. They made a 4-decade commitment to the idea that this corridor would matter. The port itself was designed from the beginning to handle the largest oil tankers in the world. Storage facilities, refineries, and transport links heading north were built as part of a fully integrated energy system, not just a dock where ships could stop. The whole design treated Gwadar as the southern anchor of a land-based energy highway running from the Arabian Sea all the way to the Chinese interior. Critics in Western countries spent years calling Gwadar a wasted investment, unfinished, underused. A project that looked impressive on paper but barely functioned in reality. And some of those criticisms had real merit. There were genuine delays. Security challenges in the surrounding region created serious problems. Political turbulence in Pakistan slowed construction at critical moments. The throughput numbers were never as high as the original projections suggested. But here is what those critics kept missing. Strategic infrastructure is not measured by how busy it is on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. It is measured by what it changes about the choices available to everyone else. Even a partially operating Gwadar fundamentally rewrites the situation. Every barrel of oil that comes ashore, there is a barrel that did not have to pass through a contested strait. Every kilometer of pipeline heading north into China is leverage that no foreign government can squeeze, no navy can intercept, and no sanction can easily reach. China spent billions building a backdoor, while others spent trillions on other approaches. 2 decades later, the backdoor was open, and that made all the difference. 2 escape routes were now in place. But pipelines and ports, as powerful as they are, both have a gap problem. What happens in the first hours and days of a crisis before those routes can ramp up to handle the full load? What does a country run on during that window, while everything is being redirected and scaled up? China had an answer for that too, and it was buried deep underground. The underground empire and the quiet revolution. Picture a cavern the size of a skyscraper carved directly into solid coastal rock. Not a tank farm, sitting in an open field somewhere. Not a collection of metal cylinders visible from the road. A massive hollow space cut into the earth itself, sealed off from the surface, filled from floor to ceiling with crude oil. Now picture hundreds of them spread along the Chinese coastline across multiple provinces, each one capable of holding enormous quantities of oil, and most of them in locations that have never been publicly disclosed. This is China's strategic petroleum reserve, and the scale of it is something most people outside specialized energy circles have simply never heard about. The United States has a reserve too. It holds roughly 700 million barrels stored in salt caverns along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. The locations are documented. They appear on maps. They have been written about extensively. Anyone with satellite imagery and a basic understanding of geology can identify them. China's reserve was built differently from the start. Construction began in 2004, with the first facilities going up in Jiang and Shandong provinces along the coast. Then Phase 2 followed in 2009, dramatically expanding total capacity. Then more phases, more expansions, stretching all the way through the early 2020s, each one adding to a network that kept growing while the world's attention was elsewhere. The caverns are cut into solid rock rather than softer geological formations, which makes them harder to detect from above and significantly more resistant to damage. They are spread across multiple coastal provinces rather than concentrated in one region, which means no single event can compromise the whole system. And crucially, many of the specific locations have never been officially announced. Estimates for total capacity across China's strategic and commercial storage combined run as high as 1.3 billion barrels of oil. 1.3 billion barrels, nearly double the maximum capacity of the American reserve, buried in rock largely invisible from satellites, and large enough to cover everything China imports from the outside world for several months. Running. Not days, not a couple of weeks, months. Think about what that means when a real crisis hits. The moment a shipping lane goes down, every country in the world starts burning through whatever reserves it has saved up. Governments start making increasingly desperate decisions under increasing pressure. Prices rise, alliances strain. The country that runs out of options first ends up negotiating from a position of weakness, accepting bad terms just to keep its economy from grinding to a halt. The country that can wait, the one that has enough stored away to outlast the panic, gets to set the terms. China spent 20 years and an extraordinary amount of money making absolutely certain they would be the country that could wait. But here is the piece of the story that most analysts completely overlooked for years. And it might actually be the most important piece of all. Because while pipelines, ports, and underground caverns are all about managing the supply of oil coming in, China was simultaneously working on something even more powerful: They were systematically reducing how much oil they needed in the first place. Here is the number that should genuinely change how you see this entire story. Oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz now accounts for just 6.6% of China's total energy consumption. 6.6%. 6%. 20 years ago, that number sat close to 30%. So, what happened to the other 23%? China replaced it piece by piece with domestic energy that no foreign government could ever threaten. Start with solar power. In a single recent year, China installed more solar capacity than the United States has installed across its entire history. Not 1 year of Chinese growth compared to 1 year of American growth. 1 year of Chinese installation compared to every solar panel ever bolted onto a rooftop, parking lot, or desert facility in America since the technology was first invented. That is the size of the gap between the two countries on this. Then layer in wind. Enormous wind farms stretch across the grasslands of Inner Mongolia and the high desert plateaus of Gansu and Xinjiang. Turbines standing as tall as skyscrapers spinning through the night, generating electricity that powers entire provinces without burning a single drop of imported fuel. The scale of Chinese wind installation has consistently surprised outside analysts who kept expecting the growth rate to slow down and kept being wrong. Then, add nuclear power. China is currently building more nuclear reactors than the rest of the world combined. New plants are coming online at a pace not seen anywhere on Earth since the 1970s building boom. Each reactor that starts generating power is another chunk of energy demand that no longer needs to be met with oil from a tanker crossing a contested strait. Then, there is the rail network. Tens of thousands of miles of high-speed electric track now crisscross eastern China. These trains have functionally replaced short domestic flights for hundreds of millions of passengers. Every one of those journeys happens on electricity generated domestically, not jet fuel refined from imported crude. The emissions numbers get the attention, but the energy security angle is just as significant. And then the number that really pulls the whole picture together. In 2024, more than half of all new cars sold in China were electric or hybrid. More than half. While debates raged in boardrooms and parliaments elsewhere about whether electric vehicles were actually ready for mainstream adoption, whether charging infrastructure was sufficient, whether consumers were interested, Chinese buyers had already answered every one of those questions with their purchasing decisions. Every electric car on a Chinese road is a vehicle that does not need gasoline. Every solar panel on a Chinese rooftop is electricity that never came from a tanker. Every wind turbine spinning in the desert is energy that was never sitting in a ship, waiting to pass through a narrow strait, vulnerable to whatever happened to be going on in the Persian Gulf that week. For years, Western financial analysts called all of this wasteful, overbuilding, government distortion of the market, too many panels being manufactured, too many cars being subsidized, more capacity than the system could ever actually use. The commentary was consistent and confident, and as it turned out, completely wrong about what the building was actually for. Then, March of 2026 arrived, and suddenly every panel, every turbine, every cavern, and every kilometer of overland pipeline started looking less like excess and more like exactly the right call made at exactly the right time, the day the lights stayed on. March of 2026, the Strait of Hormuz shuts down. Within hours, oil prices blow past $100 a barrel, then 110, then 120. Sex. Trading screens from London to Singapore turn red and stay that way. Insurance companies stop writing policies for tankers anywhere near the region. Ships that were already en route drop anchor and wait, burning fuel, going nowhere. In the Philippines, the government declares a national energy emergency. They have no overland pipeline running to Russia, no port in Pakistan, no network of underground caverns filled with months of stored